Look at a map for a second. The longest border on Earth stretches nearly 9,000 kilometers from the Atlantic to the Pacific, through forests, lakes, mountains, and empty wilderness. And it has almost no soldiers. No walls, no fences, no minefields, no permanent militarized line. For decades, that border was the ultimate proof that two countries could share power without paranoia, that trade could replace conflict, that trust could become an economic asset so valuable it felt permanent. That border is between the United States and Canada, and right now that trust is cracking. Not because Canada suddenly became a threat, not because America is under attack, not because there's a real security emergency. It's cracking because political rhetoric is being treated like entertainment, and because economic ignorance is being sold as strength. And the cost isn't symbolic. It's measurable. It's immediate. And it's already hitting American communities where it hurts most. Local jobs, local businesses, and local income. Here's what just happened. Canadians are canceling trips to the United States in record numbers. Not a small dip, not a few people changing plans, a wave. Hotel bookings dropped. Shopping trips vanished. Ski vacations got scrapped. Family visits got delayed. Convention travel got rerouted. And if you think tourism is a soft industry that doesn't matter, you're missing the point. Tourism is cash flow. Tourism is payroll. Tourism is the difference between a small-town restaurant surviving the winter or closing its doors. Canadian travelers spend tens of billions in the United States over time, and they don't spend it in Wall Street boardrooms. They spend it in border towns. They spend it in Buffalo and Detroit and Seattle and Bellingham and Plattsburgh and Montana, towns most Americans never think about, places where Canadian money isn't a bonus. It's the engine. And when that engine slows, it doesn't show up first in national GDP charts. It shows up in a hotel manager cutting staff hours. It shows up in a diner owner laying off a waitress. It shows up in a retail store watching foot traffic disappear. This is not theoretical. It is real, local economic pain. So why is it happening? Because politics has turned the U.S.-Canada relationship into a stage for chest-thumping. Threats of tariffs, talk of punishing Canada, and even bizarre, unserious statements about Canada being absorbed, as if a sovereign country is just a property deal. You might be tempted to dismiss it as noise. But in economics, noise becomes signal the moment people change behavior. And they are changing behavior. Because markets run on one thing more than anything else: trust. Trust lowers costs. Trust makes planning possible. Trust allows businesses to build supply chains that span borders without fearing the border will become a weapon. And when political leaders casually threaten to blow up a relationship that took generations to build, the rational response isn't outrage, it's risk management. That's what Canadians are doing. They're not overreacting. They're behaving like smart consumers and businesses faced with a new variable: American political instability. And that's the part Americans still don't fully understand. The U.S. doesn't just sell products to the world. It sells reliability. It sells stability. It sells the belief that agreements will hold and rules won't change overnight. That belief is a form of economic power. When it weakens, the damage is not just diplomatic, it is financial. Now let's get to the deeper mechanism, because this is the heart of the story. A lot of politicians sell tariffs like they are a weapon aimed outward. They talk like tariffs punish Canada. They talk like tariffs make America win. But tariffs are not magic missiles. Tariffs are taxes. And the first people who pay them are not foreign governments. The first people who pay them are American importers, who then pass those costs directly into American prices. That means American families, American businesses, American manufacturers. A tariff on Canadian goods is a cost shock inside the United States. And here's why that matters even more with Canada than with almost any other country on Earth. Because Canada isn't just a trading partner. Canada is part of the American production system. The supply chains are so intertwined that many products cross the border multiple times before they become finished goods. An auto part might be cast in one country, machined in the other, assembled back in the first, and shipped again. So when you inject tariffs into that system, you are not protecting American industry. You are attacking its bloodstream. That's the economic insanity at the center of this. And it comes from a worldview that sounds simple but is dangerously wrong. The belief that trade is a zero-sum fight. If Canada benefits, America loses. If America benefits, Canada loses. That idea feels emotionally satisfying when people are angry. But it's not how real trade works. Trade happens because both sides gain. If one side loses consistently, the relationship collapses. The U.S.-Canada relationship became the envy of the world because it wasn't a war. It was a system of specialization, logistics, trust, integration, and it produced wealth on both sides of the border. Now the political incentives are shifting, and this is where the story gets uncomfortable. Because the people pushing these threats are not trying to solve the real problem American workers face. They are redirecting the anger. They point to Canada because it's politically useful. It's safe, it's easy, it creates an enemy without real risk. And that distraction protects the forces that actually harmed working Americans for decades. Let's name those forces clearly. The decline of labor bargaining power, the weakening of unions, the rise of monopoly power, the erosion of antitrust enforcement, tax systems that shifted burdens downward, corporate influence that captured regulation. Those are the structural drivers of inequality and insecurity. But those topics are complex. They require policy that challenges concentrated power. They require reform that threatens donors and incumbents. Tariff threats are easier. They sound tough. They fit into slogans. They create a feeling of action, even when the action makes people poorer. We've seen this movie before. In 2018, the United States imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum, claiming it would protect American jobs. What happened next was predictable. Metal prices rose, and that hit every manufacturer that uses those materials. Automakers, appliance companies, construction, thousands of small businesses. A small group of producers benefited. A much larger group paid the price. That's not an accident. That is the political economy of tariffs. Concentrated benefits, distributed costs. A small industry gains enough to lobby hard for it. Everyone else pays a little extra, not enough individually to mobilize, but enough collectively to drain the economy. Now bring that logic back to Canada. The U.S. is threatening to blow up an integrated system that supports millions of jobs on both sides. And the first warning sign isn't a government report. It's Canadians quietly moving their money elsewhere, canceling trips, choosing different destinations, shopping at home, taking vacations in Europe or the Caribbean. That money doesn't just disappear. It relocates. And once it relocates, it is very hard to pull it back. Because trust, once broken, is not repaired by a press conference. It's repaired by time, consistency, and restraint. And the problem is, in a world where rhetoric is rewarded more than stability, restraint is becoming rare. So here's the question you should be asking already. If Canada, America's closest, safest, most culturally similar ally, can begin to pull back economically just because of political noise, what happens when other allies decide they don't want to be exposed to American mood swings either? Because that's the bigger story under the Canada story. This isn't only about tourism. It's about a global shift away from treating the United States as the stable center of the system. And if that shift accelerates, the costs will be far larger than a few canceled vacations. In Part 2, I'll show you exactly how this ripples through American supply chains, border states, manufacturing costs, and local employment, and why the people who will suffer first are the same communities that were promised prosperity by economic nationalism. Now let's make this brutally concrete, because this story isn't about abstract trade relations. It's about how modern economies actually function, and how easy it is to break them when politicians treat the system like a reality show. If you live far from the border, you might hear Canada and think it's a separate economy, like a neighbor across the street. That's not what Canada is to the United States. Canada is woven into the American production engine. In many industries, the U.S. and Canada operate like one integrated factory with a border running through the middle. And that means when you disrupt the border with threats, tariffs, insults, talk of annexation, you don't just offend a neighbor. You inject friction into the machine, and friction is expensive. Here's the core mechanism. Uncertainty kills planning. Businesses build supply chains years in advance. They lock contracts, negotiate pricing, plan inventory, and invest in equipment based on stable assumptions. So when political leaders start casually threatening a 25% tariff on Canadian goods, they are creating a new variable that no company can ignore. Even if the tariff never happens, companies have to prepare for it because the penalty for being unprepared is huge. That preparation costs money immediately. They start stockpiling. They start rerouting shipments. They start adding legal and compliance teams. They start searching for alternative suppliers. They start holding cash instead of investing. That is the real cost of rhetoric. It forces the economy into a defensive posture. And here's where the irony becomes almost painful. The places that get hit first are not global corporations. The first casualties are local communities that depend on cross-border flow. Border states are the front line. New York, Michigan, Washington, Montana, North Dakota, Minnesota, Vermont, Maine. In these places, Canada isn't a distant market. Canada is the customer. Canadian weekend shoppers fill malls. Canadian tourists fill hotels. Canadian families cross to eat, ski, visit theme parks, attend sports games, buy groceries, buy electronics, and fill gas tanks. When that flow slows, it's not a national crisis in headlines. It's a local recession, and those local recessions add up. Now let's talk about tariffs, because this is the part that gets twisted deliberately. Politicians talk like tariffs punish foreign countries, but tariffs are not paid by foreign governments. They are paid by importers, American importers. Then those importers pass the cost to consumers, American consumers. So a 25% tariff on Canadian goods is functionally a 25% tax increase on Americans who rely on those goods. It hits families through higher prices. It hits businesses through higher input costs. It hits manufacturers through supply chain inflation. And it hits at the worst time possible, when people are already stressed about cost of living. But it gets deeper. Because with Canada, a tariff is not a clean tax on foreign stuff. It's a tax on the inputs that American factories use to build American products. Canada supplies the U.S. with critical industrial materials: steel, aluminum, energy, lumber, potash, and a huge range of components and intermediate goods. Raise the cost of those inputs, and you raise the cost of American manufacturing. That means one of two things happens. Either American companies raise prices, or they cut costs elsewhere, often through layoffs, wage stagnation, or shifting production to cheaper regions. So the political promise, tariffs protect American workers, often flips into the opposite outcome. Tariffs raise costs, reduce competitiveness, and force companies to adjust by squeezing labor or relocating. Now remember, the U.S. and Canada don't just trade finished products. They share supply chains. A product may cross the border multiple times before it becomes final. So when you add tariffs, you might be taxing the same product multiple times across its production journey. That is pure economic self-harm. Imagine a car built in the Midwest. Parts come from Canada. Metals come from Canada. Energy inputs are linked. Components cross back and forth. A tariff adds cost at every crossing. Now your American-made car becomes more expensive. Then it competes against imports from other regions where the supply chain is smoother and the energy is cheaper. So America protects itself into losing. This is not theory. We've watched this dynamic before. When tariffs hit steel and aluminum, domestic prices rose. Some producers benefited, but downstream manufacturers paid more. Costs spread across thousands of businesses. A small concentrated group wins, a huge distributed group loses. That is the pattern. Now bring that logic to tourism and social trust, because tourism is the most sensitive indicator of relationship health. Tourism is not a contract. Tourism is a feeling. People travel when they feel welcomed, safe, respected. When political leaders mock your country or threaten it, you don't need a government directive to change behavior. You just choose somewhere else. And the reason this matters is because trust is a form of capital. Economists rarely talk about it like money, but it functions like money. Trust reduces transaction costs. Trust makes investment easier. Trust allows deep integration. And the U.S.-Canada relationship is one of the richest trust banks on earth. Decades of peaceful trade and cultural closeness. That trust is the reason the border is unmilitarized. It's the reason supply chains are deeply integrated. It's the reason people don't think twice about crossing. So when politicians treat that relationship as a punching bag, they are burning down an asset that took generations to build. And once an asset like that is damaged, the recovery is not automatic. Here's why. People update their beliefs. Canadians are being reminded right now that the United States can become hostile unpredictably, not through policy analysis, through the loudest voices in the room. So Canadian consumers diversify. They travel elsewhere. They shop elsewhere. They invest elsewhere. Canadian businesses look for non-American customers. They reduce reliance on U.S. supply chains. They build buffers, and once those buffers exist, the relationship never fully returns to what it was, because the old assumption, the U.S. will always be stable, is gone. This is the part Americans underestimate. Once you teach the world that you might weaponize the relationship for domestic politics, the world stops trusting you as a default. And that shift has a snowball effect, because if Canada is adjusting, other countries notice. Europe notices. Asian allies notice. Global investors notice. And they start asking a very simple question. If America can do this to Canada, why wouldn't it do it to us? So they hedge. They build alternative partnerships. They reduce exposure. They diversify away from American political risk. And this is where the story becomes bigger than Canadian vacations. The United States built enormous power after World War II by constructing a network of alliances and a rules-based trade framework. That network wasn't charity. It benefited America massively. It gave U.S. companies privileged access. It cemented the dollar's global role. It gave America influence that no other country could match. But that power depends on something that can't be printed: credibility, reliability, the belief that America is predictable enough to build your plans around. When America starts acting like a volatile partner, credibility declines. And credibility is hard to restore. Now let's talk about who benefits from this chaos, because this is always the key question. Not American consumers, not border communities, not manufacturers, not workers. The winners are the political actors who profit from division and drama. The politicians who get to sound tough on trade while avoiding the real work of fixing domestic inequality. Because the real causes of insecurity are internal. They are structural. They involve how power is distributed inside the United States. They involve labor rights, antitrust, tax policy, healthcare costs, housing costs, education. The things that would require confronting concentrated wealth and corporate power. That's hard. It angers donors. It requires competence and patience. It requires telling voters complicated truths. Scapegoating Canada is easy. It turns economics into a morality play. It creates an enemy without challenging the real power centers. And that's why this strategy keeps returning, even when it hurts the country. It's politically profitable, even when it's economically destructive. Now you might ask, so what's the real damage? How big can this get? Here's the answer. It can get very big, very fast, because modern economies are leverage systems. Small frictions create large downstream effects. A modest decline in tourism hits local employment. A modest tariff threat forces businesses to stockpile and raise prices. A modest trust fracture encourages suppliers to diversify. Over time, the integrated system becomes less integrated. Supply chains become less efficient. Costs rise. Investment slows. And the economy becomes weaker, not stronger. And the cruelest part is that the communities hit first are the ones most likely to believe the slogans. Border states, industrial towns, places that were promised that getting tough would bring prosperity back. Instead, they get fewer tourists, higher prices, and more uncertainty. The promised renaissance doesn't arrive because prosperity doesn't come from punching your closest customer. It comes from building capacity, infrastructure, education, research, stable institutions, fair labor markets. That's not a slogan. That's work. In Part 3, I'm going to bring this to the final level. What this means for American democracy, why this is a symptom of deeper institutional decay, and what a real solution would look like if we stopped chasing political theater and started rebuilding the foundations of broadly shared prosperity. Now we need to say the quiet part out loud. What's happening between the United States and Canada isn't primarily a trade story. It's a democracy story. It's a story about how a political system can become so captured by incentives, media incentives, donor incentives, outrage incentives, that it starts producing policies and rhetoric that harm the public, because harming the public is no longer politically costly. In a healthy democracy, leaders pay a price for breaking trust with allies, raising costs for consumers, and damaging local economies. In an unhealthy democracy, leaders can do all of that and still win, because the system rewards performance over results. And that's exactly what we're watching. Canada is the warning sign because Canada is the easiest test case. Canada is not an enemy. Canada is not a rival superpower. Canada is not a hostile regime. Canada is a close ally with one of the deepest economic integrations on Earth. So, if American politics can treat Canada like a target, casually, irresponsibly, for domestic gain, then no alliance is truly safe from American volatility. And if no alliance is safe, then American power begins to weaken in the most dangerous way, not through a war, but through partners slowly stepping back. This is the part that happens quietly. It doesn't come with a dramatic announcement. It comes with procurement decisions, travel choices, investment allocations, supply chain redesign. A Canadian company decides to sell more into Europe. A European government signs a new energy contract that reduces exposure to the U.S. political cycle. An Asian ally increases local manufacturing to reduce dependency. A global investor reallocates capital away from U.S.-linked supply chains. And each decision is rational on its own. Collectively, they reduce America's centrality. That is how empires decline in the modern era. Not because they lose a single battle, because they lose reliability. Now let's talk about the scapegoat mechanism, because it's at the core of this. When working people feel insecure, they look for explanations. If the system is fair and honest, leaders can tell the truth. Insecurity comes from weak bargaining power, high healthcare costs, concentrated corporate control, a tax system tilted upward, housing scarcity, and decades of underinvestment in public goods. But those truths demand confrontation with domestic power. So instead, political entrepreneurs offer something easier. They point outward. They say your problem is them. Canada, Mexico, China, immigrants, foreigners, someone outside the national family. It's emotionally satisfying because it turns complex structural pain into a simple story with a villain. And it's politically useful because it protects the people who actually rigged the system. Because the biggest winners of the last few decades weren't Canadian tourists. They were domestic monopolies. They were financial elites. They were corporations that captured regulation. They were sectors that used lobbying to socialize costs and privatize gains. A tariff threat against Canada does not challenge those forces. It distracts from them. And distraction is valuable. Because while the public argues about whether Canada is taking advantage, the deeper drivers of inequality remain untouched, and the political class keeps collecting donations, media attention, and votes. Now, if you want to understand why this strategy persists even when it fails economically, you need one concept: concentrated benefits, distributed costs. A small group benefits massively from certain policies. Everyone else pays a little? That's the perfect political trap. The small group lobbies hard, funds campaigns, buys ads, writes talking points, makes sure the policy happens. The public pays through slightly higher prices, slightly lower growth, slightly weaker local economies. But no one feels the full pain individually enough to organize effectively. That's how you get policies that make the country poorer while remaining politically survivable. Tariffs are often exactly that. Now add the media environment. Outrage is profitable. Fear is clickable. Conflict sells. A calm explanation of supply chain integration does not go viral. A dramatic threat does. So politicians learn. The more outrageous the rhetoric, the more attention they get. And attention is power in modern politics. So even if the rhetoric damages trust, weakens alliances, and costs jobs, it still gets rewarded. That creates a feedback loop. More rhetoric, more attention, more polarization, less accountability, more rhetoric. And somewhere inside that loop, real people get hurt, not in theory, in their paychecks, in their local businesses, in their communities. This is why border communities are the canary in the coal mine. They feel the effects first. When Canadian visitors stop coming, those towns don't get a national strategy briefing. They just lose money. Their restaurants get quieter. Their stores cut staff. Their hotels offer discounts that still don't fill rooms. And the bitter irony is that many of these communities were told that tough talk and tariffs would bring prosperity. Instead, they get the opposite. So what would a real solution look like? Not a slogan, a strategy. First, stop treating trade like a zero-sum war. Trade with Canada is not outsourcing, it's integration. The goal should be to strengthen the North American production base so the U.S. and Canada can compete together against authoritarian industrial giants, not sabotage each other for domestic political theater. Second, rebuild credibility. That means leaders need to understand that trust is an economic asset. You don't casually threaten tariffs on your closest ally and then expect the world to treat you as stable. If you want investment, supply chain confidence, tourism flows, and alliance strength, you need restraint and consistency. Third, address the real causes of American insecurity inside America. This is where the solution becomes politically difficult because it threatens concentrated power. It means strengthening labor bargaining power so productivity gains translate into wages again. It means serious antitrust enforcement so monopolies can't extract rents and squeeze workers and small businesses. It means tax policy that funds real public investment rather than shifting burden downward. It means investing in education, infrastructure, and research so high-value jobs can grow domestically. It means healthcare reform so families aren't crushed by a system that functions like a private tax. It means housing policy that expands supply and lowers the cost of living. These are the real tools of prosperity, not threatening Canada. Fourth, protect workers during economic transition. Some communities were harmed by globalization and technology without adequate support. That's real. But the answer is not to burn down alliances. The answer is to build a social contract that helps workers adapt, retraining that actually works, regional investment, wage insurance, stronger safety nets, and industrial policy designed to create new jobs where old ones died. That's harder than slogans, but it's how you rebuild. And finally, restore democratic accountability. Because none of these economic reforms are possible if the political system is captured. If billionaires and corporations dominate campaign finance, if regulators rotate into the industries they regulate, if media incentives reward outrage over truth, if politicians can weaponize economics for attention without paying a cost, then the cycle continues, and the country becomes weaker while pretending it's becoming stronger. That is the central danger here. The canceled Canadian trips are not the main disaster. They are the signal. They are a warning light on the dashboard that says the world is updating its beliefs about the United States. Less stable, less reliable, more volatile, more willing to weaponize relationships for domestic politics. And once the world updates that belief, it doesn't easily downgrade back. It hedges, it diversifies, it steps away. So here is the bottom line. When American leaders threaten allies and treat trade like warfare, they don't make America stronger. They make America more expensive, more isolated, less trusted, and ultimately less powerful. If you want to protect American workers, you don't start a fight with the country that buys your goods, feeds your supply chains, and helps anchor your global alliances. You fix the domestic structures that made workers vulnerable in the first place. You rebuild trust, you share prosperity, and you stop confusing loud rhetoric with real strength, because strength isn't a threat. Strength is a system that delivers results, and right now the United States is choosing noise over strategy. Canada is responding rationally. The only question left is whether America will learn before the damage becomes permanent.